So in the last video, I was talking about the changes socially to the United States in the early years as it exists under the Articles of Confederation, and some of the reasons why there's problems. We talked about Shays' Rebellion that shows the real weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. So there's discussion to change the Articles, to amend the Articles, to make them stronger, or maybe to just throw them out completely. Eventually, that's going to end up being the Constitutional Convention. But these other ideas are up for discussion also, like the separation of church and state. Most of the states by this time had sort of adopted the principle of the separation of church and state. It was the Anglican Church, which had formerly been closely tied to the king's government, was completely disestablished in the South, so it lost all state support. Only in 3 New England states, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, did the Congregational Church continue to receive state support in the form of a religious tax, but that practice was finally discontinued in New England early in the 19th century. It's also during the war that both the Patriots and the Loyalists depended on the support of women. So some women, over the course of the war, followed their men into the armed camps. They worked as cooks, they worked as nurses, and even in a few instances, women actually fought in battle, either taking their husband's place or passing as a man and serving as a soldier. Really, the most important contribution of women during the war was in maintaining the colonial economy, because while fathers, husbands, and sons were away fighting, women ran the family farms and businesses. They provided much of the food and the clothing necessary for the war effort. But despite their contributions, women remained in a second-class status. Please, like Abigail Adams, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors, would often go unanswered. And there's another group that's kind of hypocritical, the treatment of enslaved Africans. The institution of slavery contradicted the spirit of the revolution and the idea that all men are created equal. For a time, the leaders of the revolution recognized that fact and took some steps toward corrective action. For example, the Continental Congress voted to abolish the importation of slaves. Most states even went along with the prohibition. But in the South, some plantation owners actually volunteered to free their slaves. However, soon after the Revolutionary War ended, a majority of Southern slave owners really came to believe that slave labor was essential to their economy. So all of these ideas are going to come together in Philadelphia in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention, where you've got 55 delegates who gather together in what will eventually be known as Independence Hall to talk about how to fix the Articles of Confederation. These are the far wealthier people of America. They are much more wealthy than the average American of that day. They are well acquainted with the issues of law and politics because a number of them are practicing lawyers. Many of them had helped to write state constitutions. And one of the first things that they'll do is to elect kind of a leader, a chairperson. They voted to conduct their meetings in secret and have George Washington serve as that elected chairperson. And so then they just began debating the issues. Especially heated was the issue of whether or not the larger states, such as Virginia and Pennsylvania, should have proportionally more representatives in Congress than the smaller states, such as New Jersey and Delaware. This pie chart shows you the basic population breakdown of 1787. James Madison, proposed this idea called the Virginia Plan, which favored the large states. It's countered by the New Jersey Plan, which favored the small states. The issue would eventually be resolved by a compromise together, the Connecticut Plan or the Great Compromise, which would provide a 2-house Congress. where each state would be given equal representation in the Senate. But in the larger body, the House of Representatives, each state would be represented according to its population. So under the New Jersey plan, each state would have an equal vote. This makes the small states actually more powerful than the large states, because if you're looking at this, that would mean that Rhode Island, which only has 2% of the population, would have as much vote as Virginia, that had 16% of the population. The Virginia plan said that large states would have more power than small states because they had more of the population. So the Great Compromise protects the sovereignty of the small states because it creates the Senate where each state has 2 votes. And it also creates the House of Representatives where the vote is based on the population of the state. But now that you have a House of Representatives, you've got this whole other issue. How are slaves to be counted in the populations of the states? Were the slave trade and slavery itself to even be allowed under the Constitution? Disagreement on these questions between northern and southern states will finally be resolved. Here is a chart that shows the estimates of population in 1790. So as you can see, first of all, in this chart, I wrote other persons rather than slaves for a reason, because the U.S. Constitution does not ever use the word slaves, nor did it ever, but it does refer to other persons. Free population, this is the voting population. Green would be slaves. So notice, if we're talking about the House of Representatives, where the vote for each state is based on its population, look how many votes Virginia would have in 1790 if they were able to count every single citizen. So the North will say, hey, that's not fair. You shouldn't be able to count your slaves towards population. The South says, no, we should, because of course they want more power. So they come up with the so-called 3/5 compromise, which counts each slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of determining a state's level of taxation and representation. This also includes a guarantee that slaves could be imported for at least 20 more years, so until 1808. At which time Congress could vote to abolish the practice. They also have to come up with a compromise over trade. The northern states wanted the central government to regulate interstate commerce and foreign trade. The South was afraid that export taxes would be placed on its agricultural products, such as tobacco and rice. So they come up with the commercial compromise that allowed Congress to regulate interstate and foreign commerce, including placing tariffs or taxes on foreign imports, but it prohibited placing taxes on any exports. So on September 17th, 1787, after weeks of debate, 17 weeks of debate, the Philadelphia Convention will approve a draft of the Constitution to submit to the states for ratification. But you have debates in the states over whether or not to ratify the Constitution. And people sort of fall into 2 groups. Ratification is fiercely debated for almost a year, from September of 1787 until June of 1788. Those who supported the Constitution and a strong federal government are known as Federalists. Opponents were known as Anti-Federalists. Those on either side of the question could be found in all regions and classes, although Federalists tended to be most numerous along the Atlantic coast and in large cities. Anti-Federalists tended to be small farmers and settlers on the western frontier. One of the key elements in the Federalist campaign for the Constitution was a series of highly persuasive essays written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay. It's a series of 85 essays, later published in a book form and called the Federalist Papers. But the Federalist Papers presented reasons for believing in the practicality of each major provision of the Constitution. And the Federalists won early victories in the state conventions. especially in small states like Delaware and New Jersey, and also in Pennsylvania, which was a larger state. So those are the first 3 states to ratify. The Federalists will eventually promise to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. And so they'll successfully address the Anti-Federalists' most telling objection. So with New Hampshire voting yes, the Federalists won the necessary 9 states to achieve ratification of the Constitution. The larger states of Virginia and New York still hadn't ratified the Constitution at the time that it was ratified. So, the Bill of Rights will be added in 1791. Was it necessary for people's rights to be listed in the Constitution? In the early months of the ratification debates, Anti-Federalists argued vehemently in favor of a Bill of Rights, while Federalists argued against it. Anti-Federalists thought that because Americans had fought the Revolutionary War to escape the tyranny of a central government in Britain, it was necessary to stop a strong central government under the Constitution. You want to make sure that it doesn't act in a tyrannical manner. And only by adding a Bill of Rights could Americans be protected against this possibility. But Federalists sort of argued the other side. They said that since members of Congress could be elected by the people, they didn't really need to be protected against themselves. Also, it was better to assume that all rights were protected, and rather than creating a limited list of rights, since unscrupulous officials could then assert that unlisted rights could be violated at will. In order to win adoption of the Constitution and the ratifying conventions, the Federalists finally backed off their argument, and they did promise to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution.